Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1872 Oklahoma Territory, the Homestead girls who buried strangers in the Well of Bones. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the spring of 1872, the wind moved strangely across the plains west of Pawhuska, where the boundaries of what would one day be Oklahoma still blurred with the frontier. County ledgers from the era described the land as untamed, dry, and thick with whispering grass. It was here, between faint wagon trails and scattered homesteads, that two sisters, Eleanor and May Whitlock, settled with a small inheritance and a plot of land they called Hollow Creek Ranch. Early letters from neighboring settlers mentioned the women in cautious tones. "Hard-working but distant," wrote one local merchant, "and too quiet for comfort." They kept to themselves, raising a few cattle and offering lodging to passing travelers along the new territorial route. Their well, built near a limestone ridge, was said to draw the clearest water for miles. According to later references in the Osage Nation records, the area was known to both settlers and native scouts as the Hollow Ground, a place avoided during hunting seasons due to strange echoes beneath the earth. The Whitlocks likely knew this, or perhaps ignored it. Either way, their homestead became a fixed point on the route westward, a place travelers noted in passing, then never again. By autumn, rumors began to coil through the settlements. Travelers went missing, mostly men journeying alone or in pairs, often carrying coin or horses to trade. One diary entry by a mail courier in 1873 read, "Riders vanish near Hollow Creek. Locals claim the Whitlock girls serve food too kind for their means." The town marshal, Samuel Burdett, dismissed it at first, calling it wild talk of lonely plains. But the unease grew when a drifter named Jonas Cale was found dead in a ravine 2 miles east, his horse tethered, his pockets empty, his boots removed. The marks around his neck were described in the record as oddly precise, neither rope nor knife, but something between. By 1874, the ranch stood half abandoned, its shutters drawn, yet smoke still rose from its chimney. Some claimed to hear faint hammering at night, as if wood were being sealed shut from within. One passing trader said, "They were burying something, or someone, but it wasn't grain." When a search party was finally organized, the soil near the well seemed disturbed. Sheriff Burdett ordered it covered until the court could be present. But before any hearing was held, both sisters vanished. Their home was left locked, their horses untethered, and the well itself dark as pitch. Even decades later, when historians studying the Osage Nation frontier boundaries revisited the case, they noted the eerie precision of the records, the same handwriting, the same names, yet no burial certificates, no graves, and no trace of the Whitlocks beyond that final autumn. The winter that followed was unusually harsh for the territory. Reports in the Pawnee Courier described frozen wells, stranded wagons, and cattle dying where they stood. Yet somehow, faint smoke continued to rise from the chimney of Hollow Creek Ranch. When riders approached, they swore the smoke changed direction, bending with the wind as if avoiding them. By January 1875, the marshal's office finally returned to the property. Sheriff Burdett, 2 deputies, and a surveyor rode out to investigate. Their official notes were brief and unsettling. House intact, door locked, no livestock in sight, silence, unnatural. The floorboards creaked as they entered, finding cold ash in the stove, a woman's bonnet on the table, and a single Bible open to the Book of Lamentations. Outside, near the well, the snow had melted into a dark ring of soil, as though the earth itself exhaled warmth. Deputy Henry Madsen later wrote in his affidavit that when they peered into the shaft, the air rising from below smelled like rusted iron and rotting apples. The men agreed to return in daylight with a rope and lantern. The following morning, word spread that one of the deputies had fallen ill overnight, vomiting and feverish, claiming he dreamed of faces moving beneath black water. Such claims were dismissed by the doctor as exposure-induced delirium. Still, when the team lowered a lantern into the well, its flame dimmed prematurely, and the light vanished into the depths with a faint hiss. It was around this time that Dr. Elijah Crane, a county physician with an interest in toxic wells and gases, joined the case. He cited early chemical studies from neighboring territories, much like those documented in Osage Nation reports of mineral springs, suggesting that trapped vapors could disorient or kill anyone who inhaled them. He proposed that the travelers might have perished accidentally, their bodies concealed by shifting earth or collapsing stone. But Burdett wasn't convinced. He had found something the doctor hadn't. A woman's glove pressed deep into the mud near the pump, its lace torn and stiffened by frost, and beneath it traces of fabric and what looked to be a man's pocket lining. The sheriff ordered the well drained, but within days the rope snapped under pressure and the pulley mechanism broke apart. The wood was soaked, heavy, and unnaturally slick. When the surface finally settled, no bones were recovered, only 2 rusted belt buckles, a tin cross, and an unmarked locket. Inside the locket was a lock of pale hair tied with red thread. Folklore would later claim the sisters had struck a deal, one for water, one for life, as an old ranch hand phrased it. But official records mention nothing beyond evidence withheld pending review. In the months that followed, the Whitlocks were sighted twice, once near the Red River, under the aliases Harris and McCain, and again, according to an affidavit filed in Kansas Territory, running a boarding house under false papers. By 1880, the case had gone cold. The ranch collapsed under storms, the records scattered, and the well sealed with limestone. Only one ledger entry remained. Property condemned, presumed cursed. And yet, decades later, when anthropologists studying Osage Nation folklore examined settler ghost tales, Hollow Creek appeared again, as a whispered warning to travelers who strayed too far from the marked road. By 1887, Hollow Creek Ranch had become a hushed reference in local gossip, a cautionary tale mothers whispered to restless children. Yet, for the new settlers arriving from the east, it was simply another piece of abandoned land, its story buried under dust and disuse. One of them was Thomas Reeves, a farmer from Illinois, who bought the acreage through a government land auction. The deed noted prior, unrecorded tenants and a collapsed structure, but no mention of its history. Reeves wrote to his brother in March of that year, "The well is sound and the soil fair. I shall build again where the old house stood." By summer, his wife and son joined him, and the family began planting wheat across the ridge. For a time, they prospered. Then came the first unease. The son, Peter Reeves, aged 10, began complaining of whispers from below the well. He told his mother that he heard 2 women singing softly, like through water. The boy's descriptions were so vivid that Mrs. Reeves forbade him from fetching water alone. She later admitted in her journal that the sound of the bucket chain made her uneasy, as if the well were breathing. Neighbors visiting for Sunday gatherings claimed they saw faint candlelight glowing from the empty structure that had once been the Whitlock home. The family tried to dismiss it as tricks of the dusk, but in late autumn, when the wheat failed and the livestock grew thin, Reeves unearthed something while digging a new foundation, a pair of iron keys, a rusted hair comb, and a length of chain embedded in clay. He took them to the county clerk's office in Pawhuska for appraisal. The clerk, an elderly man named Elias Porter, reportedly froze when he saw them. "Those belong to the Whitlock place," he said, "the sisters who vanished. I remember the report myself." He advised Reeves to rebury them. That same month, rain flooded the property. The well overflowed for the first time in recorded memory, spilling black water across the yard. It stank of metal and smoke. The Reeves family left within a week, abandoning their belongings, never to return. Their final correspondence mentioned they were heading south toward Texas. No further letters were found. When the county attempted to resell the property in 1889, no bids were received. Even prospectors avoided the site, claiming the ground sank underfoot as if hollow. A decade later, Professor Alden Harker, an amateur historian studying frontier disappearances, revisited the case. He mentioned the property briefly in a lecture at the Territorial College, referencing the Osage Nation's extensive documentation of settler migration and unexplained losses in the region. Harker's notes suggest he visited Hollow Creek himself, describing a well that exhales cold despite the heat, and earth too soft to trust. Local papers later reported that Harker's carriage overturned near the property, killing him instantly. His notes recovered from the wreck ended mid-sentence. The bones beneath. The rest was illegible, soaked by rain. Even now, that surviving scrap remains in the county archive, brittle with age, labeled only as evidence. Hollow Creek Ledger fragment. In the early 1890s, the death of Professor Harker revived interest in the Hollow Creek mystery. Local newspapermen, sensing a story, revisited the archives in Pawhuska to find what had drawn a respected academic to such an isolated ruin. They found fragments of his field journals, smudged with water but still legible in parts, mentioning interviews with aging settlers, including one woman who had once lived near the Whitlocks. Her name was Martha Klein, recorded as nearly blind but sound of mind. Mrs. Klein's testimony painted a chilling picture. She described seeing the Whitlock sisters years earlier, hauling barrels to the well under moonlight, humming a hymn that no church ever taught. When she asked what they were doing, May had replied softly, "Keeping the water pure." Eleanor, the elder sister, had smiled at that, an expression Mrs. Klein said didn't reach her eyes. Harker's notes also reference several missing wagoners in 1873, whose routes passed Hollow Creek, connecting them with county notices long forgotten. Among the names was Jonas Cale, the drifter found strangled near the ravine years earlier. Harker wrote that Cale's boots, which had been removed, were later found sold at a trading post 50 miles north. The seller, an unidentified woman, paid with silver coins wrapped in linen. In a section labeled Environmental Theory, Harker speculated that the soil composition around the well caused rapid decay, leading to the absence of remains. He cross-referenced geological records, similar to those found in Osage Nation reports about unstable ground and sinkholes common in the area. But a later margin note contradicted his own theory. The pattern is deliberate, not natural. When the Pawhuska Gazette published excerpts of his findings, the article caused unease across the territory. Farmers claimed their wells were drying up overnight, and several swore they heard whispers in the wind from the northwest ridge. For months, no one dared to travel past Hollow Creek after dark. In 1894, the property changed hands once again. A man named Nathaniel Briggs, an entrepreneur from Kansas City, purchased the land to build a rest stop for travelers. He demolished the remains of the Whitlock cabin and began construction of a small inn. The workers soon complained of nausea, strange odors, and tools vanishing from their storage crates. One laborer swore he heard women arguing under the floorboards. Within 2 months, Briggs closed the project and left the territory without explanation. The unfinished inn stood for years, rotting in the sun, its signpost leaning toward the road like a warning. Newspaper accounts dwindled after that, as if the land itself had slipped from public attention. The few who returned wrote in private journals of unease. Birds avoided the site, and the air near the well felt colder even in midsummer. Still, the legend endured quietly. By the turn of the century, older residents would point toward the ridge and say, "That's where the ground remembers." By 1901, the newly formed Territorial Survey Office began charting old homesteads for potential farmland reclamation. Among the listed sites was Hollow Creek Ranch, abandoned for nearly 3 decades. The assigned surveyor, Calvin Dorr, a former railway engineer, recorded his first impressions in a neat copperplate hand. No habitation, structure partly sunken, well covered by rotted boards, surroundings eerily still. Dorr was accompanied by a young assistant, Peter Lang, who later provided much of what is known from that visit. In his field diary, Lang wrote, "No birds, no cattle. The air stings the nose like iron filings." He noted that when they removed the boards from the well, an unnatural chill escaped. Dorr joked that the earth was breathing ghosts. But when he leaned closer, he went pale. Floating just below the surface was a single, leather-bound book. They retrieved it with a hook and rope. The pages were warped, but intact, the cover embossed with initials, E.W. Inside were what appeared to be household accounts, feed, fabric, lamp oil. But deeper in the ledger, the entries changed. Names appeared, each followed by a short phrase. 3 nights, 1 horse, paid in silver. Then abruptly the script darkened, almost carved into the page. Settled below. When the survey office examined the book back in Guthrie, the clerk dismissed it as superstitious nonsense. But Lang, disturbed, returned privately a week later. He claimed he heard movement from the well's edge, like fabric brushing stone. In his last entry, found years later among family papers, he wrote, "I think they're still waiting. The sisters, or what's left of them." That same season, a regional report on frontier archaeology, referencing settlement data also cited in Osage Nation land histories, mentioned Hollow Creek as unfit for habitation due to subsoil instability and organic seepage. The description matched earlier accounts of disturbed ground and foul water, yet no formal excavation occurred. The area was left untouched, marked only with a wooden stake and warning placard. Locals began calling the site the Well of Bones, though no remains had ever been publicly recorded. Children dared one another to approach it, claiming they saw pale figures by the water at dusk. Ranchers avoided grazing their herds near the ridge. Even the male riders took the longer route, citing bad luck and voices in the wind. By 1905, a fire swept across much of the prairie. When it reached Hollow Creek, witnesses said the flames died suddenly, as if smothered by unseen hands. In the aftermath, not a trace of the old structures remained, just the charred outline of where the house had once stood, and the circle of stone around the well, blackened but intact. For officials, that marked the end of any practical record. For the locals, it only deepened the legend. They said the land refused to forget. By 1910, Hollow Creek existed more as rumor than place. Maps no longer marked it, and the nearest road had shifted miles east. Yet stories persisted, especially among the older settlers who remembered the Whitlocks and the strange events of the 1870s. That year, a traveling journalist named Arthur Winscombe arrived in Pawhuska while researching forgotten frontier disappearances. His articles often mixed factual record with ghostly lore, but his tone was measured, investigative, not theatrical. In March, Winscombe visited what was left of Hollow Creek. He described it as a shallow depression ringed by stubborn grass that grows too evenly to be wild. The well had filled halfway with silt and rainwater, though he noted the same metallic odor that past investigators had mentioned. What drew him most was a small cluster of objects embedded in the soil, a porcelain brooch, a rusted buckle, and a woman's comb with teeth missing. He collected them for documentation, later noting their placement suggested ritual or deliberate offering. His report cites earlier research by Professor Harker, whose fragmented notes he had obtained from the county archive. Winscombe wrote that Harker's language, especially his repeated phrase, "the deliberate pattern," echoed older Osage Nation frontier accounts describing settler practices of burying unwanted remains near water sources, both to conceal and to sanctify. But Winscombe added, "Here the sanctity is twisted, the water becomes a witness, not a grave." He published his findings in a serialized column titled Echoes from the Well, running for 6 consecutive weeks in the Territorial Review. Readers were divided, some intrigued, others furious at the revival of what they called dead women's gossip. Yet within months, the newspaper received letters from nearby farmers describing unease when plowing their fields near Hollow Creek's ridge. One wrote, "The soil sighs when turned." Winscombe returned that autumn, intending to finish his piece. He brought along a photographer, Samuel Lorne, who set up his heavy camera near the site. The 2 men spent hours capturing plates of the well and surrounding terrain. When the negatives were developed, Several were ruined by streaks of light and smudges, not uncommon for the process. Yet in one, faint silhouettes appeared behind the men, blurred but human-shaped. Lorne, shaken, destroyed most of the plates and refused to speak further about them. Winscombe's final published note read only, "Some truths are meant to rest beneath their own weight." Shortly after, he left the territory for St. Louis and never returned. County officials sealed the last remaining records into an envelope labeled Hollow Creek Case, incomplete. The file remains preserved, its paper darkened by age but intact, resting among other unsolved territorial cases. In later surveys of regional folklore, again referencing Osage Nation territory histories, the Hollow Creek legend persisted as a cautionary echo of settler greed and isolation, a tale both earthly and unexplainable. And so, within that half-century boundary, the story closed upon itself, unresolved but unforgotten. Even now, when the wind moves across the empty ridge, some say it carries the faint sound of women humming beneath the ground, keeping the water pure. By the early 1910s, Hollow Creek had become less a case file and more a legend, repeated across Oklahoma Territory. School teachers warned children not to wander west of the old ridge, and ranch hands told stories of travelers who heard the wells sing before storms. But beneath these whispers, a quiet effort began among local historians to piece together the remaining records of the Whitlock sisters. One such figure was Dr. Caroline Emmett, a lecturer from the newly established Oklahoma Agricultural and Mechanical College. Fascinated by local oral histories, she began collecting first-hand accounts from descendants of early settlers. Her notes, later archived under Emmett Folklore Collection, 1911, reveal her measured, almost clinical approach. "There is truth in persistence," she wrote, "and Hollow Creek persists more than most." Dr. Emmett's research linked the Whitlocks' land grant to a clerical error during the early days of settlement, land that had originally been part of the Osage Nation boundaries, transferred without formal treaty acknowledgement. She hypothesized that resentment between settlers and displaced native families may have fueled later rumors, perhaps even revenge myths tied to the sisters' disappearance. Still, her tone remained cautious. Not every horror is a curse. Sometimes it is simply forgotten paperwork. In her field interviews, however, she encountered strange consistency. Multiple elderly residents recalled seeing the Whitlocks after their supposed vanishing, not as fugitives, but as spectral figures standing by the well at dusk. One man swore he met a woman in gray calico who offered him water in a tin cup, then disappeared when he turned to tether his horse. Another claimed his lantern dimmed when he passed the ridge, though there was no wind. Dr. Emmett dismissed these accounts publicly, but her private letters, later uncovers, heard in estate records, tell a different story. In one, she confessed to a colleague, "I cannot shake the feeling of being watched while near the well. There is stillness there, unlike any other place I've known." In 1913, she returned for one last survey with a team of geology students. They brought measuring tools, soil samples, and photographic plates. According to her journal, they found a sinkhole forming where the well once stood, roughly 12 feet across, exhaling damp air that smells of rust and decay. Beneath it, they detected an empty cavity extending downward, but they lacked the equipment to explore further. Her final entry reads, "It is as though the ground remembers something it refuses to return." Within months, heavy rain collapsed the site entirely, burying what remained of the well. The land was declared unfit for habitation, its coordinates struck from survey maps. And yet, decades later, her colleagues would still refer to her Hollow Creek research when discussing the blurred line between documentation and folklore, much like the Osage Nation ethnographic records that balance memory and record, myth and witness. It's said that even long after the ridge disappeared beneath weeds and dust, the sound of running water could still be heard there, steady, deliberate, and faintly human. By 1915, Hollow Creek had already begun to fade from territorial talk, but it refused to vanish completely. Stories drifted eastward, taking on new names and variations. The Singing Well, the Sisters Beneath, or as recorded in small-town church bulletins, the Lesson of Hollow Ground. Most dismissed these as cautionary tales meant to keep children from wandering into the plains. Yet, a few still treated the legend as a matter of unfinished history. Among them was Marshal Ernest Dobbins, a retired lawman from Osage County, who had served briefly under Sheriff Burdett in his youth. Now old and half-blind, Dobbins claimed to have been present during the 1875 search at Hollow Creek, though his name appeared nowhere in the surviving records. In interviews given to a Tulsa newspaper, he described the Whitlock sisters as not wicked, but hollowed out, and added, "They didn't fear the dark, they listened to it." The journalist who recorded his account, Louise Tanner, noted how his tone shifted between fact and fable. He spoke of the well-breathing, of the lantern going out by its own will, and of the whisper that never stopped once you heard it. Tanner published only part of the story, omitting what she called personal confessions unfit for print. In her private diary, however, she mentioned that Dobbins gave her an object wrapped in oilcloth, a corroded brass pendant engraved with the letters M.W., likely belonging to May Whitlock. Inside was a fragment of cloth, stained dark with age. Tanner donated the piece to the county archive, where it was catalogued but later lost during a fire in 1921. Meanwhile, the surrounding settlers began to treat the Hollow Creek site as forbidden ground. Even cattle would veer away from it, and wagon wheels broke more frequently when crossing its nearby trail. Local farmers took to marking the ridge with wooden stakes carved with crosses, replacing them whenever storms swept through. "We aren't warding off ghosts," one man reportedly said. "We're reminding the land it's been seen." That same year, a regional preacher, Reverend Jonah Mills, tried to organize a cleansing ceremony. He led a small congregation to the site, reading from Psalms while scattering salt into the soil. According to participants, the ground began to tremble lightly, though no wind was felt. A woman fainted. Mills later told reporters, "The Lord has his mysteries, and some are best left buried." He never returned. Interestingly, when state surveyors revisited old boundary maps in 1916, they noted that the terrain around Hollow Creek had changed shape. The ridge itself flattened, as if pressed down by great weight. Such changes were rare, but not impossible, in regions prone to subsidence. Geologists, referencing environmental data similar to Osage Nation territorial records, attributed it to underground erosion. Still, a few of the older surveyors disagreed. "The ground there doesn't sink," one said. "It swallows." And thus, as Oklahoma moved into a new century of progress and settlement, Hollow Creek slipped quietly from living memory, preserved only in fragments of stories, church notes, and one battered county file stamped unresolved. By 1918, the Great War had drawn most attention away from forgotten frontier stories. Yet Hollow Creek found its way back into conversation when a small detachment of engineers from the U.S. Army Corps surveyed rural Oklahoma for potential water access points. Their aim was practical, to locate old wells for reactivation. But their visit to the Hollow Creek region reopened a wound that had never truly healed. The team's foreman, Lieutenant Albert Granger, recorded the visit in his field notebook. His entry, dated May 17, 1918, reads in part, "Site known locally as Hollow Creek, land uneven, clay soft, air dry. Discovered circular depression consistent with a collapsed well. Local guide refused to approach within 50 yards, claiming the ground hums at dusk." Granger and his men proceeded with routine measurement work until dusk, when one soldier reported hearing a hollow echo that repeated words. The lieutenant described it as wind resonance from underground fissures, though he later admitted the sound unnerved him. That night, they camped 2 miles east, but one man, Private Hensley, was found missing at dawn. His rifle and gear remained neatly folded beside the extinguished campfire. A brief search turned up no tracks, only disturbed earth near the ridge. Granger's report to his superior simply noted, "Private presumed lost due to disorientation." The incident never appeared in public record, but survived through private correspondence later donated to the county museum. In 1919, a new settler family, the Danforths, purchased acreage adjacent to the Hollow Creek boundary. Their youngest daughter, Martha, age 8, became obsessed with collecting stones that looked like faces. Her mother later wrote to relatives describing how the girl arranged them in small circles near their well and claimed the other women told her how. After the child fell ill too, had winter and passed from fever, the family left the land permanently. The following year, a local school teacher named Edith Rowe organized a regional folklore survey documenting ghost tales and pioneer myths for the state archives. Her notes make one final reference to Hollow Creek. The tale of the Whitlock sisters is still told in whispers. Always the same pattern: 2 women, a well, and travelers who never reach their next stop. The people who live nearest refuse to say their names aloud after sundown. Rowe observed that such consistency across generations was rare and suggested the story held a kernel of factual memory, wrapped in fear. She compared it to recorded oral histories within the Osage Nation that preserved territorial tragedies as living warnings, not through books, but through retellings. Her manuscript was never formally published, but portions were later quoted by frontier historians studying the psychological toll of isolation among early settlers. Hollow Creek was cited as a case of memory-haunting geography, where landscape and legend merged into permanence. By 1920, the area was unrecognizable, weeds and prairie grass covering what had once been a ranch, a well, and a trail. Only a faint depression in the earth remained, ringed with dry reeds that rustled even when the air was still. Locals said that when the moon hung low over the plain, 2 shadows could be seen standing near that hollow, motionless, silent, their faces turned toward the ground as if still listening for water. By the early 1920s, Oklahoma was changing rapidly. Oil towns rising, railways cutting through once-forgotten land. Yet amid the noise of progress, a quiet discovery returned Hollow Creek to brief attention. In February 1921, during the expansion of a minor freight route, workers unearthed what appeared to be a stone ring buried deep beneath prairie grass. At first, they thought it part of an old well foundation. Then one of them, a foreman named Charles Newby, noticed the stones were arranged not in a circle, but in an oval, more like the outline of a cellar or pit. The excavation crew unearthed a wooden beam, charred but sturdy, and beneath it, several small metal artifacts, a spoon, a dress pin, and a set of spectacles missing one lens. When the workers carried them to a nearby depot, an elderly man identified the items as from the Whitlock place. He claimed to have known the sisters' father back in Kansas before the family moved south. They weren't born bad, he said. The land turned them so. The discovery prompted a brief county investigation. Deputy records from March 1921 show a short entry. Excavation near Old Hollow Creek property halted due to instability. No human remains found. The report was filed and then misplaced during the courthouse fire that same summer. The same blaze that destroyed the pendant and records Louise Tanner had donated years earlier. Folklore soon filled the gap left by lost evidence. Workers began refusing to operate near the site, claiming tools went missing and shadows moved against the sun. One engineer, in a letter to his wife, described seeing 2 shapes standing at the pit's edge, women in long skirts, hands clasped. He admitted it might have been exhaustion, yet wrote, "Still, I never again looked toward the ridge after sundown." When state surveyors returned in 1922, they noted the area had subsided entirely. The pit was gone, the ground seamless except for a faint discoloration in the grass. They marked it unfit for construction, fencing it off with a sign that read, "Private, do not excavate." The sign remained for decades, even as maps erased Hollow Creek from mention. And yet, older residents continue to tell the story, each version slightly different, but always circling the same truth, that the Whitlock sisters had not been found because the land had taken them back. In regional studies of frontier memory, particularly those inspired by Osage Nation historical frameworks, Hollow Creek became a footnote, cited as an example of how landscape can carry trauma beyond written record. Scholars noted that the persistence of the legend reflected something uniquely human, a need to give form to what cannot be buried. By the winter of 1922, the final field report closed the case for good. The entry was simple: No further action recommended. Sight returned to nature. And so it was. The prairie grew over the well, the ridge flattened, and Hollow Creek vanished from sight, yet not from sound. Travelers even decades later would speak of faint echoes beneath their boots, like water moving through bones, slow and steady, remembering. By the 1930s, the story of Hollow Creek had settled into that strange space between folklore and forgotten history. It surfaced occasionally in local papers or academic folklore journals, always framed as one of the earliest frontier disappearances without resolution. The name Whitlock rarely appeared, yet the story's structure never changed. Two sisters, a well, and travelers who never reached their next stop. In 1932, the Oklahoma Folklore Society published a slim volume titled Tales of the Dust Plains. Among its collected accounts was an anonymous submission labeled The Women of the Singing Well. Scholars later determined it had been written by Dr. Caroline Emmett before her death. Her notes described Hollow Creek as a case of memory-haunting soil, the land itself carrying the voice of its vanished. She referenced old Osage Nation land records as part of her supporting research, noting how both native and settler communities describe certain areas as listening ground, places where tragedy lingers audibly. A decade later, the same term appeared again in a paper by Professor Samuel Horn, a historian from Tulsa University who studied patterns of settler folklore. He cited the Hollow Creek legend not as superstition, but as an artifact of collective guilt, a cultural scar left when land is wrongfully taken or blood spilled in isolation. His writing was careful, avoiding sensationalism, yet he confessed privately in correspondence found later that he had visited the site himself. That letter reads, "There is nothing to see now, only a depression in the earth that grows no wildflowers. But I heard it faintly, water where there should be none." Horn attempted to cross-reference older testimonies and found that many of the official documents had vanished. The Hollow Creek file from the 1870s, last seen in the county courthouse, was lost during recodes or transfers. Even maps once showing the ranch boundaries were missing or deliberately scratched over. He suspected an intentional effort to bury the matter, not out of conspiracy, but embarrassment. "No county wants to be known for ghosts," he wrote. In 1938, a WPA oral history project conducted interviews with the last surviving descendants of early Pawhuska settlers. One elderly woman, Mildred Klein, granddaughter of Martha Klein, the witness interviewed by Professor Harker, repeated almost word for word what her grandmother had said 60 years earlier. They kept the water pure. When asked what she thought it meant, she simply replied, "You can't cleanse what the land remembers." This quiet recurrence of phrasing across generations fascinated later researchers. Linguists would note that such persistence of wording, even when stripped of context, indicated deep cultural imprinting. Hollow Creek, it seemed, had become more than a story. It was an inherited caution, passed like a burden rather than a tale. By the end of the decade, dust storms swept across Oklahoma, erasing old foundations and scouring what little remained of the land's markings. Travelers who passed near the ridge claimed the wind there always changed pitch, rising to a low hum, steady and cold, like breath escaping stone. By the early 1940s, Hollow Creek was nearly erased from official geography, but not from curiosity. Wartime rationing and migration brought a wave of young workers and surveyors into the plains, some of whom stumbled upon references to the old site buried in county ledgers. One such man was Edward Langley, a junior engineer assigned to study groundwater flow for rural supply projects. While reviewing pre-statehood documents, he came across an 1874 entry marked only as "well depth unknown, contaminated." Next to it, faint pencil notes read, "Hollow Creek, avoid." Langley's curiosity led him to Pawhuska's basement archive, where he found a weathered folder labeled Hollow Creek Case, incomplete. Inside were brittle scraps of paper, the sheriff's old affidavit, fragments of Professor Harker's notes, and a faded photograph showing two women in long dresses, faces blurred by time and exposure. No caption named them, but written on the back in faint ink was a single word: Sisters. Langley, skeptical but intrigued, took the folder to his supervisor. The older man reportedly frowned and said, "That well's better left buried, son. It's got a habit of swallowing the living along with the dead." Langley laughed it off and filed the folder for review, but within weeks he requested reassignment without explanation. Years later, his widow donated his field notebook to the local historical society. The final entry, dated October 1943, reads, "Heard running water underground near the ridge. Impossible. No aquifer here. Smells of metal and rain. Left immediately." Around the same time, an Oklahoma State University research team published a geological survey of Osage County. Their appendix, referencing hydrology data drawn from Osage Nation land studies, mentioned unexplained subsurface echo phenomena in the same coordinates once associated with Hollow Creek. The report offered no supernatural claims, yet the phrasing, "persistent resonance at shallow depth," echoed the earliest witness accounts from 1875. In 1945, an article in the Tulsa Gazette revisited frontier legends under the headline, "Ghost Wells of the Territory." Hollow Creek was featured briefly, summarized as a case of missing settlers and untraceable disappearances. The piece ended with a line that unsettled readers: "The well no longer exists, but it still answers when called." Following publication, several letters arrived at the newspaper. One claimed the writer had camped near the site as a boy and heard two women whispering prayers over the sound of water. Another, unsigned, included a crude map with an X marking the ridge, and a note reading, "Don't dig where it sings." Archivists who later reviewed these materials noted how easily they might be dismissed as pranks, yet they also pointed out that the handwriting on one of the letters matched signatures from 19th century county records, a chilling anachronism no one could explain. By 1947, Hollow Creek's story was quietly sealed again. The county placed the surviving documents into restricted storage, citing degradation and local sensitivities. But to a few archivists who handled the brittle pages, one impression lingered: the faint scent of rusted water and smoke, as if the well's breath still reached through the paper itself. The post-war years brought a wave of nostalgia for the frontier era. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, small historical societies across Oklahoma began publishing pamphlets about vanished towns, ghost settlements, and unsolved cases. Hollow Creek quietly returned among them, not as a haunting, but as an odd footnote in the study of frontier disappearances. In 1951, Professor Milton Avery, a cultural historian from Norman, published a modest paper titled "Echoes of Abandonment: Lost Settlements of the Great Plains." Among 30 listed sites, he devoted 2 pages to Hollow Creek, calling it an intersection of folklore, female autonomy, and environmental decay. His tone was cautious but intrigued. "It is one of the few documented cases," he wrote, "where the absence of evidence became its own enduring presence." Avery cross-referenced earlier material, including the Osage Nation surveys of lost homesteads. He observed that Hollow Creek's pattern of disappearance, people vanishing, then stories taking root in their place, mirrored certain native oral traditions in which the land consumes those who disrespect its balance. Perhaps, he speculated, the legend of the Whitlocks is a settler echo of something much older. This connection drew criticism from conservative academics who dismissed such interpretations as romantic anthropology. Yet younger researchers found Avery's angle compelling. His notes mention visiting the ridge himself in 1950, guided by a local rancher who refused to step closer than 50 feet. Avery wrote that the land was unremarkable except for a constant low vibration in the air. He assumed it was the sound of distant machinery until the rancher told him there was none for miles. The following year, a student newspaper published excerpts from Avery's lectures. One quote spread quickly among readers: "The well may be gone, but the grew and still listens. It caught public imagination, and soon the Hollow Creek legend re-emerged, not as horror, but as local heritage. Radio hosts discussed it on evening broadcasts. Teachers used it as an example of folklore persistence. But interest turned strange when a photography hobbyist from Tulsa, Gordon Kell, decided to find the ridge. He claimed he located the depression using old maps and photographed it at sunset. When developed, one frame showed faint outlines, two figures standing side by side, blurred and translucent. Kell brought the photo to the Tulsa Tribune, which ran a small piece titled Ghost Sisters of the Plains. Though quickly dismissed as exposure error, the story spread statewide. Avery, mortified by the sensationalism, published a rebuttal. He emphasized that the Hollow Creek case was about the endurance of grief, not ghosts. He died in 1953, his personal journal sealed by his family for decades. When finally opened in 1980, one note from his last field visit read, "I heard the whisper again, the same 3 words repeated, 'Keep the water pure.'" The line echoed almost identically to what witnesses had reported in the 1870s, and again in 1913 by Dr. Emmett. For historians, it was impossible. For storytellers, it was perfect. Thus, Hollow Creek drifted once more into legend, a boundary between memory and myth that refused to close. By the 1960s, American academia had turned its gaze toward psychology, folklore, and the study of cultural trauma. Hollow Creek, forgotten in dusty archives for nearly a decade, surfaced again, this time in the context of collective memory studies. A generation of scholars, less concerned with ghost stories and more with what they revealed about the mind, began treating the legend as a case of regional haunting, not spirits, but inherited unease. In 1962, Dr. Helen Roos, a historian from Oklahoma State University, authored a thesis titled Memory and the Unquiet Landscape, a psychological reading of frontier myths. Her second chapter, The Hollow Creek Complex, examined the recurring phrase, "Keep the water pure," as a subconscious expression of guilt and repression among isolated settlers. She noted that the same sentiment appeared in Osage Nation oral traditions, water as memory, wells as witnesses, and speculated that the Whitlock legend might have fused with those older cultural ideas during years of frontier contact. Roos visited the Pawhuska archives in 1963 to review surviving field reports. The clerks described her as polite, methodical, but visibly unsettled after handling the old Hollow Creek case, incomplete folder. One noted she asked to be alone with the papers, remaining for hours in silence. Later she wrote, "The ink has faded, but the smell has not." In her research notes, Roos described faint staining on one of the affidavits, circular rings of reddish tint she assumed were rust from water exposure, but her tone changed near the end. Certain markings appear to have been added later, perhaps by the same hand that wrote the margin initials EW. No further elaboration followed. When Roos presented her findings at a small conference in Tulsa, she emphasized restraint. Hollow Creek's power lies not in what happened, but in how it refuses to vanish. The human mind preserves its own hauntings. Attendees described her demeanor as calm yet distant, as though still listening to something beyond the room. The following year, she published a condensed article in Frontier Psychological Review. It reframed the legend entirely, not as supernatural horror, but as a symptom of isolation and buried violence. "Every frontier," she wrote, "has its well of bones, whether dug in soil or memory." The essay gained quiet acclaim, later cited by cultural historians, exploring how settler guilt manifested in stories of cursed land. Around that same time, a rural electric cooperative laid new power lines across Osage County. Workers excavating near the supposed coordinates of Hollow Creek uncovered blackened wood fragments, perhaps from the original well covering. The foreman, unaware of the legend, brought them to the local historical office. When catalogued, the wood emitted a faint metallic smell and left brown residue on the handler's gloves. The pieces were stored, tagged, and, according to a later inventory audit, missing within 6 months. In 1965, the Tulsa Herald ran a short article about Rousse's research, headlined, "The Well That Wouldn't Stay Buried." It closed with her most quoted reflection, "History ends where the ground stops talking. Hollow Creek still whispers." To some readers, it was poetic, to others, a warning. Either way, Hollow Creek had returned, no longer a ghost story, but a mirror held to the living. By the mid-1970s, the legend of Hollow Creek had become something of an academic curiosity, an unsolved case that straddled anthropology, geology, and folklore. Oklahoma universities had begun small, state-funded archaeological initiatives to catalog forgotten homesteads, and one young researcher, Daniel Ford, requested permission to investigate the coordinates once linked to the Whitlock Ranch. His proposal framed it modestly: an environmental survey of abandoned well sites along the old Osage boundary. The request was approved in 1974. Ford and two assistants spent 4 days on location, setting up camp near what topographical maps still marked as a subsurface depression. The group found little, no clear evidence of structures, only scattered fragments of iron and a few square nails embedded in the dirt. Still, Ford's field notes hinted at unease. "The ground feels hollow," he wrote on the second day. "When tapped with a rod, it sounds like striking the lid of a box." On the final morning, one of his assistants, Mary Linton, discovered a patch of soil darker than the rest. Beneath a few inches of dust lay a bent tin plate, its underside marked with the faint etching of initials, M.W. The team recorded the find, photographed it, and placed it in a specimen case. That evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Ford described hearing a rhythmic knocking beneath their tent, 3 slow thuds, then silence. He attributed it to the shifting ground. When the team returned to Norman, their photographs failed to develop properly. Several came out blank, with streaks of light running diagonally across the film. The tin plate, meanwhile, corroded rapidly in storage, leaving behind only a residue that smelled faintly metallic, almost like blood. Ford's preliminary report, filed in 1975, remained unpublished. However, in a follow-up interview, years later, he admitted that the coordinates didn't match the official maps. They were several yards east, directly above what geological records identified as an underground cavity. The formation was shallow but extensive, resembling the remains of a collapsed well system. The report concluded, no immediate evidence of human remains. However, stratification suggests disturbance in the late 19th century. The discovery drew quiet attention from the Oklahoma Historical Commission. One internal memo referenced the site's folklore and advised against publicizing the details. Given the association with prior legends, see Osage Nation Records, 1870s, it is recommended that further excavation be deferred to prevent misinterpretation. Despite this, word spread through local communities. Amateur treasure hunters began visiting the ridge at night, carrying lanterns and tape recorders, hoping to capture voices or find relics. A few claimed to hear faint humming from the soil, like distant machinery. One visitor described seeing 2 silhouettes standing over the hollow, heads bowed as if listening. By 1977, the state officially sealed the area as a heritage preservation zone, though no monuments or signs marked it. Ford's field notebook was archived, except for the final page, which appeared torn out. That same year, an Oklahoma radio station aired a short Halloween feature on the mystery of the Homestead sisters. The segment ended with the recorded sound of dripping water, then faintly, a woman's voice whispering, "Keep it pure." The host claimed it was archival ambience from an open well. Listeners weren't so sure. And once again, Hollow Creek slipped into uneasy silence, neither disproved nor fully believed, but always waiting beneath the surface, patient as the earth itself. The 1980s marked the beginning of Hollow Creek's second resurrection, no longer through rumor, but through rediscovered evidence. In 1980, the sealed journals of Professor Milton Avery, the same historian who had investigated the site in the early 1950s, were released by his estate to the University of Oklahoma. Among the pages were his typed lecture drafts, marginal notes, and one small leather-bound notebook labeled Private Field Observations, Hollow Creek. The contents were sparse, but haunting. Avery had written about the sound of distant water, despite the absence of aquifers, and the strange consistency of the legend's phrasing across 3 generations. Keep the water pure. He noted that the expression appeared in both settler letters and Osage Nation oral history transcripts from the same period, suggesting that the phrase was more than superstition. It was cultural memory, carried by both sides of a fractured landscape. What unsettled readers most were his last 3 entries. August 14, 1952. Heard low humming, windless night. August 15th. Something shifting under the soil. Cattle avoided ridge entirely. August 16th. Saw reflection in the dirt. 2 women standing at the well. No well remains. When these journals became public, the media seized on them. A small Tulsa-based production company produced a documentary titled The Well That Wouldn't Die. It aired locally in 1983, blending Avery's notes, historical accounts, and new interviews with descendants of settlers who had once lived near the ridge. The tone was subdued, part history, part quiet dread. One interviewee, Ruth Danforth, granddaughter of the family that had farmed near Hollow Creek in 1919, recalled her grandmother warning, "Don't drink from the ground that remembers." She said it without irony, as though repeating a family rule. After the broadcast, letters poured into the producer's office from viewers claiming to have experienced similar sensations, uneasy vibrations in the air, dreams of 2 women near a well, the scent of metal before storms. Psychologists explained it as mass suggestion, triggered by the show's somber imagery and repeated mention of whispered voices. But a few geologists who examined the area confirmed low-frequency tremors still registered intermittently beneath the ridge, likely due to shifting clay strata. Nevertheless, the legend grew. The following year, a folklore journal reprinted excerpts of Avery's diary, calling Hollow Creek a frontier case study in how guilt becomes geography. Scholars began debating whether the entire phenomenon, sounds, sightings, recurring language, represented an inherited trauma from early settlement, blending cultural echoes of Osage Nation land loss with settler fear of the unknown. Avery's personal artifacts were later displayed at a small museum exhibit in Pawhuska titled Frontier Shadows. The centerpiece was his field notebook, open to the final page, where a single handwritten line stood apart from the rest. "I understand now. It was never about the sisters. The well remembers us all." Visitors described the room as unnervingly quiet, as if the air thickened around that sentence. One curator later said she felt a faint vibration beneath the display case, steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat through stone. By decade's end, Hollow Creek had become both academic fascination and local myth again, neither proven nor dismissed, only whispered about in classrooms and campfires alike. The ridge itself, fenced and overgrown, remained undisturbed, but at night some said the ground there still shimmered faintly after rain, as though reflecting a light no one could see. By the 1990s, Hollow Creek had become something more than a legend. It was a mirror for how history itself forgets. Writers and historians began treating it not as a ghost story, but as a metaphor for the silence buried beneath settlement. The academic revival of the time, led by folklorists and cultural anthropologists, found new meaning in its lingering echo, the idea that land holds memory longer than paper. In 1992, Dr. Robert Kincaid, a cultural anthropologist at the University of Kansas, published The Bones Beneath, Frontier Silence and the Persistence of Place. His first chapter revisited Hollow Creek in detail, framing it as a psychological scar upon the map. He drew connections between the Osage Nation's oral recollections of listening ground and the settler accounts of the singing well, arguing that both traditions reflected a shared recognition of the land's consciousness. "It is not haunted," he wrote, "it is remembering." Kincaid visited Pawhuska that same year and spoke with locals whose families had farmed near the ridge. Many had no direct stories, but they remembered warnings to stay off the land, to never dig too deep, and to leave offerings of water before planting. One elderly resident, Marjorie Allen, recalled her father's saying, "The well gives back what it's owed." Shortly after Kincaid's book release, interest spread beyond academic circles. A young Oklahoma author, Leah Crane, inspired by the Hollow Creek case, published a historical novel titled The Well of Bones in 1995. Though fiction, it blended real details: the missing travelers, the vanishing sisters, the eerie refrain, with imagined dialogue drawn from court affidavits and field journals. Crane cited the Osage Nation's regional history as a crucial source in her acknowledgments, noting how the overlap between myth and memory shaped her storytelling. The book became a quiet success, earning cult status among readers of dark historical fiction. In interviews, Crane described her creative process. "I didn't invent Hollow Creek, I only gave it back its voice." Meanwhile, local preservation groups petitioned for the ridge to be protected as a historical site. The Oklahoma Historical Commission initially refused, arguing insufficient evidence of any standing structure. Yet when engineers surveyed the area in 1998, they recorded faint subterranean voids consistent with collapsed tunnels or wells. "No groundwater found," the report read, "but residual humidity remains." That same year, a group of university students filmed a short documentary titled The Hollow Creek Record for a folklore class. They camped overnight at the ridge, interviewing residents, collecting soil samples, and recording ambient sounds. Near midnight, one of the microphones captured a low hum, rhythmic and steady, lasting 8 seconds before fading. The professor later dismissed it as wind interference, but the students insisted it came from below. Their project never aired publicly, but snippets circulated online years later, reawakening public fascination. The brief clip, now grainy and warped, shows their lanterns flickering as a soft voice murmurs indistinct words. Listeners debated what it said. Some claimed it was a woman's voice repeating, "Keep it pure." By the turn of the millennium, Hollow Creek had transformed yet again, from forgotten tragedy to cultural legend, a story passed through generations of scholars, dreamers, and skeptics alike. Its facts blurred, but its presence endured, steady as the unseen water beneath. And so, even in a century of satellites and science, the ridge remained fenced and untouched, its coordinates unmarked, its soil still whispering through the wind, a quiet reminder that history never fully buries what the earth chooses to remember. By the early 2000s, Hollow Creek existed in that thin twilight between history and myth, too documented to dismiss, too uncertain to define. The archives in Pawhuska held only fragments now. Harker's incomplete affidavit, Emmett's field notes, Avery's final page. Each bore the same marks of time: faded ink, warped paper, faint rings of rust, like water stains that never dried. In 2003, a graduate researcher from Oklahoma State University, Lydia Penn, revisited the file while compiling a thesis on cultural persistence in post-frontier legends. She was meticulous and unsentimental, approaching the story as data, timelines, field coordinates, linguistic parallels. Yet, in her conclusion, she confessed something rarely seen in academic writing. Some histories resist closure. This is one. Penn compared the Hollow Creek records with similar entries in Osage Nation territorial archives, noting how both traditions spoke of land that remembers. Her analysis framed the legend as a convergence, not a haunting, but a shared acknowledgement of consequence. The Whitlock's well, she wrote, was never simply a hole in the ground. It was a mirror for those who forgot how to listen. The thesis earned quiet praise, then disappeared into the university vaults. But something curious happened in the years that followed. Hikers who wandered near the old ridge, guided by rough directions from forgotten maps, began leaving small jars of water there, as if offering tribute. None of them could say why. Some claimed they'd read about the story online. Others said it felt instinctive, like honoring a place that was still alive. By 2008, a regional folklore documentary revisited the case, showing aerial shots of the land. Nothing but wind-torn grass and faint depressions in the soil. Yet even through the camera's hum, a low vibration lingered, indistinct, but rhythmic. The narrato spoke softly over it. Some say the well still breathes, others say it dreams, and perhaps both are true. Today, nothing remains of Hollow Creek Ranch. No signpost, no well, no bones. Yet locals still point toward that part of the prairie when storms gather. They claim the wind there smells faintly of iron and lilac, and that if you stand quietly, you can hear two voices beneath the rain, finishing a hymn that never ends. No one has ever found their graves. No one ever will. But in the silence between thunder and wind, the story endures, as it did in the county records, in the Osage Nation histories, in every scholar's cautious note and every whisper carried through the plains. The land keeps its secrets well, and somewhere, beneath that soil, the water still moves, slow, deliberate, remembering every name it ever swallowed.